Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here tonight. Welcome to our last, but by no means least, lecture on this series on Evolution Matters. I'm curious, how many of you have attended all 4 of these? Oh yeah, excellent. Guess me too. 3? 2? How many of you spoke? Penny? Excellent. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight and to be the host and facilitator of what will undoubtedly be an exhilarating discussion on the impacts of human activities on the ecology and evolution of our ocean and its organisms. First, I'm going to very briefly introduce our speakers, who will in a few moments also introduce themselves and their work, showing you a couple of slides each. With us tonight, on the end there, is Dr. Samantha Joy from the University of Georgia. Next to her is Dr. Bruce Robeson from the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. And next to Bruce is Dr. Randy Rachin from Boston University. Their research interests span from the deep sea floor through the immense water column and up into the coral reefs. And today they will be sharing their perspectives on the state of our ocean and the extent to which our activities are shaping the evolution of ocean species and frankly the ecosystem as a whole. Before we get started, I wanted to share a few thoughts with you to basically put us all in the ocean mindset, so to speak. There's nothing that sticks more in people's minds than facts that could be useful in trivia, right? 99% of our Earth's habitable volume is ocean. The top 10 feet of our ocean holds as much heat as the entire atmosphere. The largest animal ever to roam in the ocean is the blue whale, right? That includes all the dinosaurs. This is the largest animal ever, and its heart is the size of a small car. Microbes abound in the ocean. There's about 10 to the 27th in total in our ocean, and if you put them end on end, like a string of pearls, 10 to the 27th microns of microbes would span the Milky Way galaxy. It's 105,000 light years in length. The Great Barrier Reef is the largest living structure on Earth. It can be seen from the moon. And seafood, of course, is one of humankind's most important sources of protein. Today, 80% of the world's population lives within 60 miles of the coast, and yet over the past decade, 600,000 barrels of oil have been spilled each year from ships. This isn't big Deepwater Horizon type oil spills, this is from ships. Plastic kills about 1 million seabirds and about 100,000 mammals each year. 60% of the world's reefs are at significant risk of being lost in the next 3 decades. Commercially valuable fish stocks have declined by as much as 90% in the last half century. And if you care little about the animals and creatures of the ocean, which is entirely in your prerogative, death and disease caused by polluted coastal waters costs the US about $13 billion a year. And the annual economic impact of hepatitis alone from tainted seafood is about $7 billion a year. Okay, we've gone from interesting facts to depressing ones. But rather than sit here and just ruminate on these tidbits of information, we're excited to tackle 4 questions, or to rather address and focus on these 4 questions that you see in front of you as our talking points. I'm going to end up asking each of the panelists to respond to each of these questions in a few minutes, about 3 minutes an answer. And during that Q&A session, if you've got a quick, short question, please raise your hand and ask it. You know, if you want something clarified or you're a little bit confused, please chime in. But our hope is to get through the 4 questions so you all have an idea of what their perspectives are, and to leave some time at the end to allow for a more fruitful dialogue with you all, the audience, so that you can ask more long-form questions and we can really get into discussion about the state of our ocean today. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Dr. Joy, who will start off by telling us more about a bit about herself. Unless, Mandy, you want to sit there and I'll do your slides. Either way. Because you're on you're mic'd right there.
I can sit this way. I'll do
All right.
it here. I don't need to be big.
All right, very well.
I got a big mouth.
There you go.
Hi. First of all, I'd like to thank Pete for inviting me to be with you tonight. My name is Mandy Joy. I'm from the University of Georgia. I'm a microbiologist by training, but I also am a little bit of a chemist. And I work on perturbations in the oceans. And I've worked on perturbations of various types throughout my career. I started off looking at eutrophication in coastal systems, so pollution in coastal systems. And then I started working on oil and gas about 15 years ago. And the image up here in the top left-hand part of the slide is the comparison of a natural oil seep on the seabed on the left panel to the Deepwater Horizon wellhead. The Deepwater Horizon actually today is the 7th anniversary of the Deepwater Horizon oil well blowout. 11 men died when that rig exploded, and over the course of the next 84 days, around 200 million gallons of oil were released into the ocean, and around 500,000 metric tons of methane were released in the ocean. That's a massive, massive perturbation. Something unlike, nothing like that's ever been seen in the oceans before. And when we started working on this particular problem, we were interested in how the microbial community responded to the Deepwater Horizon oil well blowout. And the thread of my work is really how microbial populations, the little worker bees that drive elemental cycling on the globe, and on land and in the sea, are affected by human perturbations. And I just put one little slide on the bottom here that shows you sort of a species transition diagram over time, going from before the oil spill. We actually had a long-term time series site about 10 miles away from the oil spill that we sampled a month to the day before the well blew out. And the comparison of one type of organism, Cycloclasticus, which is an oil-degrading microorganism, and how the species distribution changed throughout the oil spill. And what's interesting about this figure is that the little light blue bars are the Cycloclasticus that were dominant before the oil spill. And they were able to tolerate the oil infusion pretty effectively. They didn't get replaced until after the oil well was capped, and the other parts of the community had shifted, and the Cycloclasticus then shifted, and the normal ecotip type that we see, the little light blue bars, the only place that we see them now are at natural seeps. We don't see them anywhere around the wellhead anymore. That population has been replaced, and 6 years later, that population is still the same. Now, the other two slides that I showed, the other two components of this slide, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, but the other two things that we work pretty aggressively on is looking at habitat destruction and species loss, mainly in the subtropics in Panama and Belize. Mangrove habitat destruction is a huge problem in the subtropics. They do it for producing shrimp. They grow shrimp in these fish ponds. They clear cut the mangroves. It has all kinds of implications that we might have a chance to touch on later. And the final aspect to my work that's similar to the work we do in the Gulf of Mexico, this is a picture from the Arctic. And this is a time series starting in 2005 on the top left. And you can see the little white bars that I've spliced the images together. These are in the same region. And what you can see is that the red lines are methane flares coming out of the seafloor. So this is a 10-year record of increased methane flux in the Arctic that you can see visually. So over the course of 10 years at one site, methane efflux from the seabed is increasing, and that's because the temperatures are warming and gas flux from the bottom is increasing. And the question is, how does the ocean respond to that? Can the organisms that live in the ocean buffer the atmosphere and consume that gas before it gets out? So I'll stop there and move it on to Bruce.
Thanks, Mandy. Bruce, your slide's up.
Thanks. And I'm Bruce Robeson, and I want to thank you for bringing us together for this discussion. I call myself a deep sea ecologist, but I'm just a Southern California beach kid who kept going out further and deeper. The deep ocean habitat, that vast living space between the surface of the ocean and the bottom, the deep seafloor, on a global average is 4 kilometers deep. It is far and away the largest living space on Earth. And as a consequence, it's home to the largest animal communities and the largest ecosystems on the planet. The greatest number of animals on this planet live in that vast ecosystem. And it's hugely important in the entire biome, the living elements of our Earth, because of its huge size, because of the tremendous biomass of creatures that live there. And yet, because it is inaccessible to us terrestrial air-breathing creatures, it is largely unknown. And think about it. In some respects, what must be the most important in terms of numbers of animals and biomass and size, the most important ecosystems on the planet are almost unknown because it's very difficult to be able to enter that habitat and to study it. We've been sampling the deep sea for more than a century, but for the most part, thank you. For the most part, we've sampled it from the surface. Scientists on ships reached down with nets, groping more or less blindly, hauling up what they could catch, and trying to understand what was going on down in that immense habitat based on what they could haul up. If a forest ecologist or desert ecologist were to presume to tell you how forest or desert ecosystems work without ever having visited the forest or the desert, you might have reason to be a little skeptical. And it was very dissatisfying to be a deep sea ecologist without ever having the chance to enter that realm. Well, a few years ago, we were able to use technology to make the switch. The deep sea floor had been accessible through submersibles like Alvin for decades. But to work in the oceanic water column, that huge living space, was really out of reach. So in the last 30 years, I've been using manned submersibles, human-occupied vehicles like that little one-person Deep Rover submersible, and robotic vehicles like this ROV, a remotely operated vehicle, Tiburon, to explore the oceanic water column down beyond the depths where any scuba diver could hope to go. We've made tremendous discoveries about how the ocean works. Many of them have surprised us tremendously. For example, while we had been accustomed to the animals we could catch in nets, and many of them are represented in the upper left there, hard-bodied creatures like fishes and squids and crustaceans. Many of those animals were well known to us. But when we entered the habitat and began to see it with our own eyes and with high-resolution video camera, we realized that the nets had only been telling us part of the story. Gelatinous animals, for example, are hugely important in the economy and the ecology of this vast living space. And yet, because they're very fragile, soft-bodied, and delicate, our nets had, for the most part, been destroying them. Many of us believed that we had underestimated the total biomass of the ocean by as much as a quarter, because we had biased sampling methods that didn't let us understand everyone who lived there. Well, our ability to enter the habitat and see things with our own eyes, and now to conduct manipulative experimental research, has radically changed our perception of how the deep ocean works. We're beginning to understand patterns like animal behavior patterns. We can see the interactions between species. We can measure physiological processes in the natural habitat. The work that we've been doing in Monterey Bay, where my home base is the only place on the planet where this kind of research is being conducted in a routine fashion. And yet the kinds of things we're learning there have applications globally. And the purpose of our institution is to combine science and engineering to develop the kinds of technology that will allow us to answer questions that previously could not have been answered because we lacked the technology to do it. And I'll stop there. Randy?
Thank you, Bruce.
So I'm sensing a theme a little bit already, which is how hard it is to work in some of the inaccessible places of the ocean. And I have it easy by comparison. I work in shallow tropical coral reefs, which are scuba diveable depth, and in most places, many of you in the room have probably been to one, right? How many people have already snorkeled or seen a reef with their own eyes? Yeah, right. So you know how beautiful and to some extent how accessible they can be. And of course, I couldn't keep it easy for myself. I had to take the hard route and spin the globe and go to to the most inaccessible coral reef on the planet. And so I have the honor of being the chief scientist of the Phoenix Islands Protected Area, which is a place where the international date line roughly meets the equator. So I call it X marks the spot. And it's owned and operated by a country that many of you have probably never heard of, but it's the Republic of Kiribati, spelled Kiribati on this map. That's how it's spelled. And they own more ocean area than almost any other country, but yet they have some of the smallest land area. They're a least developed country, but they own these 3 archipelagos, and you can sort of see their 3, we're on the wrong slide. There we go, that one. You can sort of see where they are. And the Phoenix Islands Protected Area, and this teal box in the center, is roughly the size of California for a sense of scale and perspective. Or another way to phrase it is sort of all the New England states smushed together. So it's a very large ocean area, and it's an uninhabited archipelago, which offers us an opportunity to take a look at what's happening without human influence in a place that's really important globally, because it's where the hot spots in the Pacific form during El Nino events. And if you click, there should be an animation that comes up. Yep. So this is sort of a close-up of the box, taking a look at what happened right before and right after the closure. So if you take a look on the left, you'll see each one of those little lights represents a fishing boat that was fishing for tuna in the protected area prior to its closure. And on the right is the same 6-month period post full closure, showing how effective this was. And so this is a really important protected area, not only because of where it sits geographically, but because it's actually protecting a place that needs protection. It is remote, but it was heavily impacted. And so now if you click to the next slide, I hope, the previous one, I don't know why they're out of order.
That one?
Nope, the close-up, the very first one where you were.
Sorry.
Yep.
That one.
You should be able to see that this box represents not just 8 islands, which have shallow tropical coral reefs, where I've been spending most of my attention, but it also has underwater mountain chains. Right on the left side, you can see this deep series of seamounts, and it has a whole lot of that open ocean habitat, that large living space that Bruce was just talking about. And so it's an opportunity to take a look at what's happening on a global scale, using this as a natural laboratory to look across all of these habitats in a space where humans are not having the same level of local human impact. Again, in this area the size of California, there are 24 people total living on one island. And so this is really a vast ocean area that I have been really lucky to be a part of, and I've been working with my colleagues across all of these different ecosystems to try to stitch together the story of what's been happening over time and really what does the best case scenario look like, meaning if every space is protected, what can we learn from the Phoenix Islands? So I'll stop there just to keep it quick.
Thank you, Randy. All right. So let's go ahead and get started then with our questions here. We'll start this one off with Randy again. So the first question is, during the course of your career, what are some of the biggest changes, good and bad, you've seen firsthand in marine ecosystems?
So I'm going to give you the coral reef perspective here, and I'll give you the bad first and the good second, so that we can get the depressing news out of the way. Of course, what I've seen in my career to date has been the decline of coral reef ecosystems, and this has been really global. So, for example, even just this year, 2017, you've seen the demise of the Great Barrier Reef, right? The second third of it go, whereas the first third went last year, right? And so now in a short 2-year period, we've seen 2/3 decline of the largest coral reef system on the planet. We have seen, even in the Phoenix Islands protected area, bleaching and mortality on a scale that even if we look back through collaborators and our collaborative team, we've looked through coral cores, and in centuries, we don't think there's ever been this scale of mortality that we've seen happen in the last 10 to 15 years. And we've seen the demise of the Belizean Barrier Reef. Everywhere I've worked, it's been the same story. There's been decline and demise, and in different ways in different spaces. It's typically been because of a mix of factors, which is really complicated. It's usually, do you know the phrase "luck favors the prepared"? It's kind of the opposite of that, where these systems were primed for demise. They were already being put up with or dealing with local pollution and sedimentation stress and stress from, these days now, sunscreens and plastics and everything else that we can possibly think of. And then there was a single catalytic event, right? A major disease, a hurricane, a bleaching event that really sort of caused demise. And we lost what's called resilience of the system, where it was harder for it to bounce back. So we've seen all that. I've seen it firsthand. I've helped to document it, and it's awful. On the plus side, what I have seen is I've seen some spaces resist, and I've seen some spaces recover. And in some cases, recover more quickly than we ever could have imagined. And the Phoenix Islands Protected Area is really one of those cases where we saw one site go from 100% coral cover to 100% mortality, and in a mere 6-year period, bounce almost all the way back, and then resist the next bleaching event, suggesting that there are mechanisms in play where protection and remoteness and potentially evolution, which we're still hoping to document, right, give these systems a chance to recover and surprise us. And that has been really hopeful and is a message that I'm holding on to.
Well, just to be contrary, I'll start with the good first. Recently, we've seen the development of marine sanctuaries. The Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary is a huge swath of oceanic water and coastline that has been established and has played a large role in preserving and helping the local ecosystem to recover. We've also seen proper fishery regulation help the return of commercial fishery stocks like sardines and salmon off California. There are successful recoveries and the restoration of commercial fisheries stocks and sustainable fisheries is a good example of how we can make a difference and how good changes are still taking place. On the other side, a lot of organisms, a lot of animals are disappearing from waters that we used to be able to see them and fish them, and where they occurred in abundance. Back when I was a kid, there were abundant abalone off the coast of Southern California. Same for Pacific lobsters. They're pretty much gone now, and those sorts of things are not part of the community. Another problem that we're seeing that has more of an impact on the deep ocean is invasive species. In the case of the waters off California, we've seen invasions of a very large, aggressive, pugnacious squid, the Humboldt squid or the jumbo squid. These animals ordinarily live in the eastern tropical Pacific, and yet in recent years we've seen pulses of them moving north into California waters, occasionally as far north as Alaska. We ferreted out the reasons that we believe that this has taken place, and they are as follows. These animals evolved to compete successfully in warm tropical waters with relatively low oxygen content. We altered the situation in waters that they didn't ordinarily inhabit. We've made the ocean warmer. We've reduced the oxygen content. In addition, these squid compete for food with animals like big tuna. And large pelagic fishes like tuna also feed on the young squid. So we've altered the situation off California to make that environment far more appropriate to to the characteristics of this species of squid. So we've made it warmer, we've reduced the oxygen. Physiologically, they are well adapted to succeed in those conditions. Plus, we've reduced competition for food and reduced predation on their young. And as a consequence, there has been an explosion in that population. They've moved north into California waters. It turns out that they've also occupied comparable parts of the southern hemisphere. And so one of the risks we run is what we've seen when an invasive species like Dosidicus, the Humboldt squid, expands its population. When they moved into California, they virtually knocked off the commercial hake fishery because the jumbo squid ate all of the hake. They also clobbered the local market squid fishery. And there has been a lasting impact from this invasion. So that's a very large change that we've been able to witness and to document, along with what we think are the causes. And we're also seeing big changes in the overall composition of communities, not as a result of a single cause like the expansion of the squid population, but also subtle changes that occur throughout entire communities. Big changes are taking place, and in many cases, whether we realize it or not, we are responsible for those changes.
Well, they've touched on a lot of the big issues: coral reefs, invasive species. This is a tough question because there's so many 5-alarm fires in the ocean today. I think that personally, for me, the biggest changes that I've seen that have shocked me has been in the Arctic Ocean. Reductions in ice cover and warming have led to not only loss of habitat for charismatic fauna like polar bears, but the entire food web in the Arctic is shifting because of the loss of ice. A lot of the phytoplankton, the trees that produce oxygen in the ocean, if you want to think about it that way, they live associated with ice in the Arctic. And when you take that ice away, those ice algae disappear, so the entire food web is compromised. And the Arctic ecosystem is an incredibly special and amazingly beautiful place that just in the 10 years that we've been working up there has changed dramatically and extensively, and will only continue to change because it's warming at a pace that's significantly more rapid than the majority of ocean habitats. So that's the bad, and I could go on and talk about oil spills and eutrophication and red tides and things like that. But I want to talk a minute about the good. And Bruce mentioned marine protected areas, MPAs, and I think that one of the biggest challenges facing the oceans is overfishing. We've taken out a lot of the big tuna, a lot of the big commercial fish, whales. It's really hard to get an idea of what the whale populations were like pre-human intervention. But you can almost count on the fact that they were markedly larger and more expansive than they are now. And it leads one to wonder, what were the oceans like when you had these big charismatic animals diving to depths of 1,000 meters and pooping and recycling nutrients and transferring materials top to bottom in ways that we can't even fathom today because there's such a tiny number of these animals left. But the good is these marine protected areas, and there's a huge initiative that the United Nations is pushing called the High Seas Alliance, the High Seas Initiative, to essentially help recover the ocean's biomass in the high seas. And the high seas are the areas that aren't in the 200 nautical mile EEZs of country, the exclusive economic zones of countries. So I think the High Seas Alliance and the work that they're doing to basically restore open ocean habitats and increase biodiversity in those habitats, we'll probably never get back to a pre-human condition, but anything we can do is better than the situation now. And the results that have occurred in places like the Phoenix Islands and other of these large MPAs suggest that, these sorts of efforts are so worth it. And not only do you see effects within the MPAs, but it bleeds out across the edges of the MPAs. So you get a increased habitat health coefficient, or however you want to think about it, even outside the boundaries of the protected areas. So it's something it's a global movement. I think that most countries have bought into it and are pursuing it, especially the Pacific Island nations. I think they're the most aggressive in terms of pushing out, policies towards improving health of the open ocean. But I think it's something that gives me a lot of hope for the future of the health of the ocean, is that we're putting so much effort into doing this. But I think, to really make a difference, we're going to have to hit a point of 20 or 30% MPA within the next decade to really prevent catastrophic damage to the system.
So, can you, in one sentence, we'll start with Mandy, what's one way in which the ocean supports humankind that most people might not think of? Make it 2 sentences if you have to. What's one way in which it supports humankind?
So the oceans, I think of the oceans as a sort of a planetary thermometer. And most people, I cannot do this in 2 sentences, Pete. It's impossible. So you think about all the things the ocean gives us: oxygen, seafood, aesthetic pleasure. We cruise around and we see blue water. Water is intoxicating to humans. It's just comforting, and it gives us pleasure, and we feel safe and happy when we're out on the water, most people. And I think that if I had to say, the one thing that the ocean gives us that people don't think of, it's I would say the kidney function, the cleansing function. The oceans recycle materials. They remove toxins like, fertilizers. They serve as, they're not just a planetary thermometer, they're a planetary, cleansing agent. They're vital for the survival of not only humans, but everything else on the planet. The microbes will be here long past humans. But if we want to survive, we've got to keep the oceans healthy, period.
A way that the oceans influence us that most people are unaware of concerns CO2 flux. We're all familiar these days with the concerns about the carbon dioxide balance, atmosphere and ocean. Before it became a real issue, a major controlling factor that brought carbon dioxide and organic carbon out of the atmosphere and into the ocean were the migrations, vertical migrations of trillions of small animals. Fish no bigger than this, little shrimps no bigger than that take place on a daily basis. It's called in our world the carbon pump. There are uncountable numbers of animals that live in the oceanic water column, and a great percentage of them, perhaps at least half of them, spend the daytime hours in deep, dark water, hiding from visually cued predators. At night, when the sun goes down, they move up into the surface layers to feed in the darkness. This daily shift of biomass up and down in the water column, covering 500, 600, 700 meters, is the largest mass migration on Earth. And by animals moving up into the surface layers, feeding, moving down to depth during the day, and pooping, they bring carbon, organic carbon, out of the surface waters and down into the midwaters, and then helping to sequester it on the seafloor. This carbon pump is a basic feature, a global feature of this planet that I think most people are unaware of.
I'm so sorry I'm going last on this question because I fully agree with what both of you said. So I think what I'm going to do is answer this question by creating a placeholder for the unknown. So I think a lot of the major things that the ocean has done for us are things that really are discoveries that have taken place in just the past few decades. And I think that the ocean is a vast ecosystem which has so many undiscovered species, or at least in the process of discovery, and many, many more which we haven't even begun to touch. We don't fully understand the microbial world. We don't fully understand large portions of the ocean which have never even been seen by humans. And so I want to leave a placeholder for the things that the oceans might do for us that we don't even discover yet, or haven't even discovered yet. And I think that that's really important, to leave a place for that discovery, because oceans are probably doing more than we can even recognize to this date.
Yeah, that's great. And just to provide an example of what Randy was just alluding to. Hydrothermal vents were discovered in the late 1970s. And since then, we viewed them as these really interesting and exotic hotspots, right? Literally and metaphorically. You have communities of animals there that we had not expected, and so on. But studies of the emissions from these vents in recent years suggest that they are significant in providing the ocean with some of the trace metals that is essential for all life. So let me put it another way. Hydrothermal vents are kind of like the ocean's multivitamin. So they are releasing metals like iron and so on that are critical for a lot of the plankton that Penny spoke about in our first lecture series, for example, that produce half the oxygen you breathe. And that's what Randy's alluding to. There are these processes as we continue our exploration and study of the ocean, we begin to realize that, in fact, the things that we most relate to, whether it's a tuna or a coral reef, are inextricably linked to the processes that are even happening in the deepest, darkest ocean, right? And we, of course, are linked to them. So there's no escape, folks. I mean, we're all part of this, so.
It's true.
Thanks. Those are great. To give you all a chance to ask questions, and just keeping an eye on the time. Question number 3 was about assuming that we don't do anything to reduce atmospheric CO2. What other measures can we take? I'd like to suggest we skip that and kind of roll it into some of the answers or questions you may all ask. And let's just hop to the 4th question, after which we hear from our panelists. We'll turn it over to you all. And this one is, we talk a lot about the impact of climate change and what its impact on species and ecosystems. But just to be clear, it's not likely to wipe out all life in the ocean, right? What we're talking about is that it's going to really drastically change our biosphere. So if humankind simply continues on its current path for the next 150 or more years, the question I have for the panel is, how will marine life evolve in response to this new world ocean, as it were? And what kinds of animals might we expect to see, and which ones are at risk of being gone? So why don't we do something fun? Let's start from the middle this time with Bruce, and then we'll go to Mandy and then Randy.
Okay. Nasty prediction time. If we don't do something about the way we're heading, we're going to see massive changes in the composition and structure of these vast oceanic ecosystems that I'm talking about. The jumbo squid that I talked about as an invasive species moving into California and Peru are an example of a species that is able to reproduce rapidly, grow quickly, has a very large brood size, and a short reproductive cycle. Lots of animals like that are poised to move into ecological niches that are being vacated by animals that we overfish or drive out because of pollution or for any number of other factors. And chief among the threats are gelatinous animals. I mentioned briefly the scope of gelatinous animals out there in the deep ocean is incredible. All sorts of different kinds of animals, carnivorous, predatory animals, as well as grazing animals that feed on phytoplankton and small particles. If we continue to alter the composition and structure of these oceanic ecosystems, what we're going to see is that opportunistic species like jellies of all kinds, I can say the names, they won't make much of a difference, but medusae, ctenophores, siphonophores, larvaceans, salps, doliolids, all of these gelatinous animals have the ability to move into niches previously occupied by fishes, squids, shrimps, and other long-lived, slowly reproducing animals, and displace them, and then hold on to those niches such that the entire structure of these communities is changed. So one of the big threats that we can anticipate, we can predict, but without any great authority about what's going to happen where and when, is that these opportunistic species are going to move in and take over the ecological roles of other species that we influence through our anthropogenic activities.
I'll just add a couple of thoughts because that's spot on. I think that one of the big changes that's happening even now is that as the oceans are pushed and pressed and stressed, the heat content of the ocean has increased. If it weren't for the oceans, the heat content in the atmosphere would be so much more than it is now. Most of the heat that has accumulated through global warming is held in the oceans, and that heat is causing increased stratification, it's causing lower oxygen levels and all kinds of other effects. And that leads to what Bruce was talking about, these changes in habitat quality, which removes species that were living in what was an optimized habitat but no longer is, and the invasion of these opportunists. But along those same lines, there will be some habitats that are essentially uninhabitable for most organisms other than microorganisms. So even jellyfish need oxygen, right? So the low oxygen, anoxic, you've all, I'm sure, heard about these dead zones that occur globally. There's a huge one in the Gulf of Mexico that's about the size of 2 Rhode Islands, and it has been expanding rather consistently over the past 20 years or so. And we've been working there for the past 6 years, and what we've seen has just blown me away, because when you go there in the summer and it's stratified and it's anoxic, you see phytoplankton in a thin layer in the top meter or two, but then below that, it's all microorganisms. There's just nothing except microbes in that water. There's no copepods, there's no shrimp, there's no fish. When you go to the bottom, there's no worms in the seabed. It's just been abandoned. It's like an abandoned building in the worst part of New York City. And it's uninhabitable to anything except microorganisms. And like I said before, the microbes will outlast us all because they can adapt. There are microbes that can live in just about any condition. But when you think about the quality of life in the ocean for organisms, it's being degraded at a rate that I don't think most people can even fathom. And if you haven't seen it firsthand, it's hard to believe when someone tells you, Like when someone says, oh, the Arctic can't be that bad. Well, if you see it, it is that bad. But if you don't see it and you just see a picture of a polar bear on a little teeny iceberg, you feel bad for the polar bear. But when you realize that that's what's happening throughout the Arctic, then it's a really bad thing. So, I think we're moving towards an ocean dominated by smaller organisms, like microbes, and by these taxa that can, sort of the cockroaches, if you will. I hate to call it. I love jellyfish, but they're kind of like cockroaches. They'll survive a nuclear holocaust, and they can do just about anything. But they don't serve that vital function that fish serve in the ocean. So changing the functionality is going to change the ocean, as Randy alluded to earlier, in ways that we can imagine, but in trajectories that we certainly can't predict.
I think the thing to add to that, to both, because I agree with both of you, it's completely spot on, is sort of two things. One, sort of alluding to what your comment earlier, I love that analogy of the kidney function of the ocean, right? The cleansing of the ocean is that right now there's a lot of invertebrates, a lot of animals who are constantly feeding and moving particles and moving organic matter and nutrients through the water. And as we get replacement by jellies and by bacteria in some of these more oceanic habitats, and coral reefs in particular, we're going to see a rise in seaweeds. And those are fundamentally different, right? They're plant material as opposed to animal material, and we're going to see a loss of ecosystem function as these, there's a really famous paper out there that coined this phrase, the slippery slope to slime, and we're going to start, I think that's kind of what we're all sort of describing in various ways, right? In seaweeds and in jellies, and we're going to see a lot more of that, and it's not just the loss of these beautiful animals that we love, but it's, of course, the loss of all of that ecosystem functioning and all of those important processes that we just discussed earlier. And one of the things to me that's the scariest about these changes is that some of these changes might still be beautiful. And so you might jump in the water and see a sea of jellies and say, my God, it's gorgeous. Look how much lives in the ocean. Or you might jump on a coral reef, a former coral reef, and say, look, there's still a coral there, and look at all these beautiful seaweeds, and look, I see a fish. Isn't this great? And I'm a mother, and I worry that my children are going to jump in the ocean and not know what they lost, because they're going to still see something that is reminiscent of what it used to be. And that concept is called shifting baselines. And it's something that I think is genuinely scary, because it is hard to get under the water. I mean, many of you have snorkeled a reef, and bravo, I'm so glad that you have. And I would kill to have seen a reef 50 years ago, or 80 years ago, or 100 years ago, or 500 years ago, right? And I wonder 150 years from now if people will want to see it just 150 years ago and not know what it would have even been like before that. And so this change in ocean ecosystems, in some ways to us, is so dramatic, but I worry that in other ways it may be perceived as subtle or minor. And I don't know, I hope that, I think we are going to see a change in organisms, and I hope we're smart enough to recognize it.
Yeah, and just to bring it all back to humankind, for the sake of those who may not be as in love with the ocean and its critters as we are, although I'd be surprised if there are any of you in this audience, it is important to remember that humankind really does depend on the ocean, right? And when I don't just mean so that you can go fishing and eat something, although that is a huge part of humankind's protein, right? On the whole, comes from seafood. Some estimates put it at about 80%, as I showed earlier. But it's also important to remember that going back to the unknowns that Randy had referred to before, I would suggest that it's important for us to recognize that while we may not understand everything in the ocean, that is no excuse to not exhibit a degree of concern. And by analogy, I often like to think of this as insurance on your car, right? Paying for car insurance seems like a waste of time until you need it. And it's easy to think, well, this might not happen or that might not happen, and we tend to have those arguments a lot. What if climate change isn't as bad as we think it is, right? For those of us who look at the data, that's hard to believe. But there is that what if. And I think, to me, thinking about the future of the ocean, being incredibly mindful of the value that we know that it plays, and being mindful of the fact that it may very well be doing a lot more than we realize, and that we may be in a really bad way if we let things get too far, is a very rational approach to mitigating risk for people. Again, if nothing else, right? And I think that's something that we should keep in the back of our minds.